Welcome to the Coptimizer Podcast, a platform dedicated to uncuffing your true potential in public safety. We're here to provide you with valuable tips and insights that will help you optimize your life and career. I'm retired Chief Patrick Flanley, and I'm honored to be your guide and coach on this journey. Here, I'll share the latest insights and strategies to help you survive and thrive in the demanding world of public safety. Our noble duty is to protect and serve. We embody the role of peacemakers in our communities. However, this profession's immense physical and mental demands come with a price. If we fail to take a proactive approach for our well-being and lead ourselves first, then the stress from the job can and will lead to poor health outcomes. We have all seen it play out. Not only does this impact our professional and personal lives, but it also affects our ability to fulfill this sacred duty. Like many of you, my journey has been filled with tremendous challenges, with highs and lows. However, through creativity, experience, and a positive attitude, I successfully managed over 30 years in law enforcement, emerging healthy and happy. Now, I am driven to share what I've learned to show you that the path is not all doom and gloom. There is hope and a profound purpose in serving your community, and I'm here to show you that it does not have to come at the cost of your health and well-being. Join us as we explore cutting-edge research, interview top experts, and share inspiring stories of transformation. Whether on duty or off, it's time to optimize your potential and live your best life. Get ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered. This is the Coptimizer Podcast. Greetings all. Welcome back to another episode of the Coptimizer Podcast. I've got another great guest this week. I know I say that every week, and I guess if there ever comes a day where I say we've got a terrible guest, then it's time to hang up the show. But Brian Willis, a long-time law enforcement trainer and somebody that I've admired for a long time for the work that he's done, huge impact maker in law enforcement. So Brian, welcome to the show and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Patrick. My pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I think people that listen to this podcast are going to know who you are, but for those that maybe don't, can you give us a little bit of background about who you are and your career in law enforcement training, and set the stage for, I think, what is going to be a cool conversation today?
All right. Well, I'm a retired sergeant for the Calgary Police Service in Western Canada. So Calgary Police Service is an agency now, about 2,300 sworn officers, 900 civilian employees. So I started with Calgary in 1979, retired in 2004. So in a month, I will have been retired for 20 years. But in my career, I worked as patrol officer, briefly as a tactical officer prior to and during the 1988 Winter Olympics, worked as a patrol sergeant. And then the last part of my career, the last 8.5 years, I was a supervisor in charge of a unit, a full-time unit in our training section that was responsible for all of the officer safety training, subject control tactics training, driver training, and incident command training for the police service, both for recruits, because Calgary runs our own 6-month recruit academy, and for in-service personnel. And I was also a member of our crowd control section, and the name changed numerous times for 19 of my 25 years. The last 15 years as a supervisor in charge of training and development, served as deputy commander during World Petroleum Congress, G8 Summit, some other events. And then since my retirement, I've had the privilege of traveling around North America and delivering training on leadership and professional development for law enforcement trainers and performance enhancement imagery.
Performance enhancement imagery. Did I say that correct? All right.
You did.
So that's something that we're going to get to, and I'm looking forward to that conversation. I think for some, the concept is going to be new. For others, they may probably just think about it in a different way.
Yes.
And, but yeah, so, I followed you for a while. And I know I've attended some of your trainings in the past. It's been a long time. So before I touch into some of that, I'm just really curious because I've been retired now for just over 2 years. My career started in 95 and I retired in 22. And it's I find it interesting the perspective that I've gained in the 2 years that I've been retired. And I would say the first year I was retired, I didn't feel like I was retired at all. I just felt like I was kind of like on an extended vacation or leave or something like I was going to have to go back. I still felt like my phone might ring. I might be responsible for something. Um, but for 20 years, that's a pretty cool milestone. And I come at a lot of the topics in my podcast are around health and wellness, optimizing performance, hire healthy, retire healthy. So I got to start by saying, if you didn't tell me you've been retired for 20 years, I look at you like there's no way that guy's been retired for 20 years. So you look good. So you must be taking care of yourself.
Well, it's something that I talk a lot about, that self-care rituals for self-care. So I work very hard to practice what I preach. So, fitness is very important to me to maintain that activity, nutrition. And the other thing for me is that I've learned to be anal about my sleep and work very hard to give myself the opportunity to get 8 hours of sleep a night. Now, I don't think anybody actually gets 8 hours of sleep a night, but I work very hard to give myself the opportunity for that. So yeah, it's something that you have to keep working at. It's easy to let it go. It's easy to fall into some bad habits, especially when you travel a lot for business. But if you make it a priority, then it's something I think is beneficial and a lot of people talk about longevity. I'm more interested in health span than lifespan. So, however, I mean, I'm 67 now, but however long I'm going to live, I want to be healthy in that. I don't want to be old and crippled and have some of those health issues. So, those things are a priority to me. Yeah.
So you mentioned health span. Maybe you're a Peter Attia fan, and I know
Yep.
he's a very popular longevity doc, and he was actually friends with my backyard neighbor, Dr. Sarah Hallberg, and I know you and I have had some messages back and forth about Sarah and her work. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that quick and sudden stop at the end.
Yeah.
Not the long, slow decline. And so for those listening, if you think about a continuum, like your life starting, go from birth to death, I think what most of us want is functionality. We want
Yes.
independence. We want to be able to take care of ourselves, do the things that we need to do. And then when the time comes, we want it to be quick, hopefully painless, but not a long, slow, steady decline where you wind up in really kind of in a state where you can't care for yourself and you rely on others. And for police officers, it's really, really important to pay attention to this. I think it's it's probably why I'm so passionate about this, because early in your career, it's easy to think, hey, you know what? I'm invincible. I'm going to live forever. I don't have to worry about all that stuff, or I'll wait until after I retire to take care of myself. But the data is just not good. Longevity is not in our corner when it comes to law enforcement. A lot of reasons for it. Primarily,
Yeah, I think we need, sorry to interrupt, but I think we need to get that message to people right at the start of their career. So again, if you look at the data, the research say around cardiac issues, so our heart health issues start in our 20s and 30s, not in our 60s. They might manifest themselves, but again, if you look at the work of Jonathan Scheinberg, in his research, the average age for the first cardiac event in the policing community in America is 49 versus 67 in the general population. And again, you go back to Peter Attia. One of the things I've heard Peter Attia say is one of the lessons he remembers from one of his professors in medical school was the professor pulled all these medical students, said, what's the first indicator of the first cardiac event for the majority of males under the age of 65. So what is the first presenting symptom of the first cardiac event for the majority of males under the age of 65? So people were guessing about heartburn and pain down the left side and partial paralysis or whatever, all these different things. And the answer was sudden death. So for over 50% of males under the age of 65, the first cardiac event they have results in that sudden death. Now the numbers have come down a little bit, but they're still very close to 50%. So I think we need to look at this early. And this is why, from a training perspective in the academy, I think fitness needs to be something that's done with recruits in the academy, not to them. And by the time they leave the academy, they should know how to develop their own workout plans with minimal time, with the shifts that they work, with minimal space, with all the demands of life. But if we're not giving them these skills early, if we're not talking to them about the importance of sleep and giving them strategies early, then they're gonna do like a lot of people in our generation did and wait till they retire, and then sometimes we're struggling really badly with that. So
yeah. Oh man. And from a training perspective and from a officer development perspective, it's all interrelated. You can have the best equipment, you can have the best trainers, you can provide all of those resources, but if the individual is not optimized, if they're sleep deprived, if they're stressed, if their nutrition is poor, it's going to impact their ability to perform on the job. And then eventually it's going to roll into their ability to be able to regulate their emotions. Some will be able to perform through it just fine, some won't. And the internet is flush with videos of officers that don't handle it well. You don't become a YouTube star because you did a good job. Very, very, very rarely do we see those being shared, but you will become a quick international star if you lose your temper, you react poorly to stress, you perform poorly under pressure. And that's really what we want to talk about today. And it's kind of cool to have this conversation because it's all connected.
yes.
And I like to give a quick story. I was just lucky. I stumbled onto data in the first couple of years in my working career that on some of John Violante's work and others where the just longevity numbers were just bad. And I was just trying to get physically fit and perform well for a SWAT PFT because I was trying out for my SWAT team. And I came across this data from John Violante and others. I read a book, a trainer from California named Phil Maffetone, doctor out there, wrote this book. It's called The Big Book of Health and Fitness. And he used to train triathletes in the 80s and 90s, Mark Allen, Mike Pigg, like some of these world-class athletes. And he had nothing to do with law enforcement, but when I was reading his book, he talked about 3 stressors: physical, emotional, and chemical. And he said, if you're not paying attention to those 3 stressors, it's going to impact your athletic performance. And he was the first one that also talked about adrenal stress and how adrenal stress impacts recovery, what it does to your cortisol levels. And I just couldn't help but to think, I'm like, my gosh, like these athletes are worried about the stress of competing. And I'm sure it is very stressful, but cops are out there worrying about the stress of survival and getting into these engagements. Why aren't we talking about these things? And so, all the dots just started to connect for me early. I did a wellness lecture for my agency in like 1998, 1999, talked about these things. And, the sad reality is that we're now 20, 25 years later, and the outcomes are not getting better. They're actually getting worse. Officers are not less obese. They're more obese. Our suicide rates are increasing. They're not decreasing. And this is with Even since the 21st Century Policing Initiative out in 2014 that identified that officer safety and wellness pillar, our outcomes are not getting better. So we've got a lot of work to do. Again, for today, I want to talk about why some of these things are interconnected. And someone like you, with your level of expertise and your years of training, it just to kind of touch back on something I was getting to earlier. What do you see as a trainer now, traveling the world, training law enforcement officers? What are some of the trends that you've seen, good or bad, in the last 20 years, and where we can bring in some of this health, emotional regulation, and how you think it impacts performance, and then again, for our longer conversation today, what do we need to change, or what do we need to double down on to get better? That's
Well,
a big question.
I think we need to look at this like as and I like the concept of the infinite game that I borrowed from Simon Sinek, that he borrowed from James Carse. But again, I think what we need to look at is this training from pre-hire to post-retire. What are we doing to develop people throughout their careers? I don't think we pay enough attention to these things in a proactive manner at the academy level and as part of the field training phase. Again, like I said, I think sometimes that there's a lot of academies where fitness is something that's done to the recruits as opposed to done with them. I think there's still too many academies where the message around sleep is overrated. You can sleep when you're dead. And there's some of these academies that are forcing people to get through the academy on 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. And then they wonder why people aren't learning, because that's not conducive to learning. Sleep is where we actually learn. So that learning process, the neuroplasticity, actually takes place during sleep. So, and again, we need to look at an academy. So are you in the academy? Are you teaching decision making, critical thinking, problem solving, emotional intelligence, communication skills? Or is the fundamental message of the academy is shut your mouth and do what you're told? Because there's still a lot of those academies where they're not learning emotional intelligence. They're not learning how to communicate. The only thing they're allowed to say in the academy is yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, those basic type of things. So I think we need to look at the basic elements. And I think what we need to do is start to look at this from a proactive perspective. So if you look at, say, the psychologists that work in the law enforcement profession, pretty much all of them are clinical psychologists, and they perform a critical role. And we absolutely need to provide help and services for people when they're struggling. But what if we took a different approach? What if we took a high performance culture approach to this? And what if we looked at hiring sport and performance psychologists, say, as high performance directors for agencies? And right from the start of the academy, the model was based on what can we do to give people strategies to allow them to set them up for success. What can we do to give people mental skills training early and often and weave it in through the academy, reinforce it in FTO, and then reinforce that again through other people's careers? And there's a number of sport and performance psychologists that I've talked to that believe that if we did that early and wove it in, that it would provide that preventative impact down the road to prevent some of the wellness and mental health issues that we have. So I think we're starting to do a better job. We're seeing some agencies that are doing some very good things from a kind of comprehensive wellness perspective. But I think we need to look at some of these things. We need to take a model. So there was a program started in the early 1900s by a French naval officer by the name of Georges Hibert called Les Méthodes Naturelles, the natural method, which was functional fitness interwoven with courage and ethics. Now, Les Méthodes Naturelles is still going strong over in Europe, but I think what's important for us is the credo, and the credo is be fit to be useful. So if we understand that we need to be fit to be useful to ourselves, be fit to be useful to our families, to our brothers and sisters in the profession, to the communities that we serve. And then we tie in with that a philosophy from Jay Dawes, a professor at Oklahoma State University, who does a lot of work with the tactical athlete community, policing, law enforcement. And Jay's philosophy around fitness is we need to be aggressively average with our fitness. And what he means by aggressively average is most of us tend to focus on one element of fitness. Like we like to lift, or we like to do CrossFit, or we like to do longer endurance events or running or other things. But we need all of these elements of fitness. So we need a strong aerobic foundation, an anaerobic foundation. We need strength. We need power. We need endurance. We need mobility. We need flexibility. We need all of these. So again, that's the message of be aggressively average, but then it goes back to that fitness needs to be something that's done with people in the profession, not to them. And then the last piece, and I'll shut up, is I think we need to pay strong attention to culture and leadership. So Gabrielle Salfati, who's a professor of criminal justice at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, or a professor of psychology at John Jay, talks about, she splits out stress and burnout. She says that stress is operational, burnout is organizational, which aligns with how the World Health Organization identifies or defines burnout, that it's unrelated workplace stress issues, but it's specific to the workplace. And so if we look at some of that, I think the antidote and the cure to burnout is good culture and good leadership. So if we're not paying attention to culture and leadership, being intentional and deliberate about that, and creating great cultures, developing leadership skills in people throughout their entire careers, and not confusing leadership with rank, position, and title, then I think all of these things start to come together and serve a very critical function that we can start to address the overall professionalism, productivity, health, and wellness of the people in the profession as well. So,
yeah, that's awesome. So going on, based on your commentary on academies and the way that we're training there, it is interesting. I think we have seen at least a little bit of a shift where people are becoming more aware that maybe this full paramilitary or military style training environment is not the right answer. And what I try to tell, my thought is that you can have a little bit of both. You can have structure, you can have organization, you can be demanding in a training environment, but but I love the way that you say it, but if you do it, to them, then I just don't know that it sets people up to be receptive, to create kind of that learning environment, that positive learning environment. It feels like I just got to survive this instead of being in that moment to soak up what I'm being taught. So do you have advice or suggestions for people that are running academies or people that are inside of academies that maybe have a little bit too much of the old school mindset? Like, hey, you know what? I survived, you'll survive too, suck it up, buttercup. What would be your advice to them in terms of maybe here's how we can, do both?
I think first of all is we need. I think there's a lot of that. That's the way it was when I went through. Or we abuse people under the guise of tradition. But again, if we look at this, you can have high standards, and people can work very hard in those environments, and that's been proven. But if it is a culture of fear, if it's almost an abusive culture, if it's a culture where we're screaming and yelling, and again where we're using physical exercise as punishment. So we go back and we wonder why people stop working out when they get out of the academy, because it's seen as a form of punishment. They relate physical activity, physical exercise in the academy to punishment. And this screaming and yelling, and what I see in some places is the first part of the academy is all this screaming and yelling and abuse of them. Some it carries on throughout the entire academy. Some it's the first part. But again, what we need to understand from training is, are we training people for critical thinking or just for compliance? So if the model is shut your mouth and do what you're told, then we should have no expectation that they know how to communicate to people when they get out in the street, that they know how to solve problems, that they know how to take initiative, because that's not what they're taught. We also need to understand that in order for things that take place in training, if we want them to transfer to the street, and this is something we're starting to pay more attention to, is the transfer of learning, then context is key. So stress is not the key to effective training. Stress is not the key to effective training. It needs to be done in contextually relevant situations. It needs to be done in environments that look, feel, and sound like at least some piece of the real world that they're going to function in. And that needs to be done in increasingly complex manners. But if we're screaming, yelling, and trying to stress people out at the start to weed people out that don't have what it takes, there's nothing to support that. People are going to leave. And I'll give you an example. And they're a very good agency, but their last recruit class, they started with 20 people. They were down to 10 by the end of the first month. They lost 50% of that recruit class in a month. Now, when I talk to people in that agency about, what's the consistent reason why they left, what they consistently hear from people is, well, this is not for me. And it's not that the profession is not for them. It's that they're imagining themselves being abused by people in a position of authority in their agency for the next 20 or 25 years. And that's not for them. Why would we want that? Why would any of us want that? Especially in an environment where everybody's hiring. I can go somewhere else where I can get treated better. So it costs them tens of thousands of dollars because they hired these people because they had the traits and characteristics that they thought were in alignment with the values, the mission, vision, and values of their organization. And then they lost 50% of their people in the first month. There was a recent news article I read where one academy, their last class, they graduated 28% of the people that started. The previous class was about 35 or 40, and the class before that was around 50%.
Wow.
So if those are your
70%
numbers,
washout.
if those are your numbers, then there's a significant problem with your hiring or with your training or with both. But in some of these, it's training because people are saying, you know what, I don't need to be treated this way. I can go to somewhere else where they will treat me better. And it's not an environment that's conducive to learning, and it doesn't teach people how to perform under pressure. What it does is it teaches people how to be abused by people in authority in their agency. So again, context is critical. So the context is, I need to take abuse from people in a position of authority in my agency. The context is, once I'm in a position of authority, I get to abuse people. That's why we see some of these videos that we see, because that's what they've learned. That's what we've taught them.
Well, and that's what any veteran, any officer that's been on the job for a little while should recognize those traits too, and what they see on the streets and what they're dealing with, right? The abused always tend to become the abusers. So with that in mind, I mean, and I do think there is a little bit of a shift in the mindset for this generation as they're coming into the job. They're being raised in a different manner. So if we try to train them in an old model in a new time, that probably that should tell us something. But some of those numbers, like 70% washout rate, that is crazy. I mean, I'm just putting my chief hat back on for a minute, and I'm thinking if I had a 70% washout rate, I would be like, there's a lot of time, money, and expense that goes into getting somebody hired. So if you're washing them, if you're washing them out for I'd be curious to see what's causing that high level of even 30% is way too high. I mean, by the time you get somebody hired, hopefully you've screened for some of these issues that may weed them out already. But wow, that's a big number.
But again, if we look at what we're doing, we're hiring because people have values, traits, and characteristics that we think are in alignment with our mission, vision, and values of our organization.
Yeah.
But then what do we do when we get to the academy? Pay attention to a lot of these academies. Every male in the academy has their head shaved. And so we take them because of their individual strengths, their talents, their life experiences, their values, their character is in alignment with us. And then we work for 6 months in the academy to turn them into robots. And, so at one academy, I'm looking at pictures. These recruits are a week from graduating. And every male still has their head shaved. They're still running from class to class to class. There's a picture that they posted. And these were pictures that the agency posted, the academy posted. There's somebody in uniform, I assume it's a command staff person or something, at the front of the room. And every recruit is sitting in this perfect posture with their hands in the perfect position, staring straight ahead. Nobody's making eye contact with this person in uniform at the front of the room. So if that's the environment at the academy a week from graduating, then what are we turning out? Are we turning out robots, or are we turning out people that have emotional intelligence, have the ability to communicate, have the ability to, or are they being trained to rush from call to call to call to call and to rush into everything, because that's what the last 6 months has been about. So I think we need to go back and look at what are we actually teaching. And like I said, the research is very clear. In order for transfer of learning to take place, then the training needs to be done in an environment that is representative in some way. There needs to be contextually relevant environments that's representative, that looks, feels, sounds like at least some slice of the real world. And again, when we start at those foundational levels and we build in complexity and intensity as they go throughout, as their competence and confidence builds. But I think we need to go back and look at some of these things right from the very start. And then what are we doing to invest in our field training officers? Because, trainers are in one of the most influential leadership positions in a profession.
Absolutely.
Are we giving them leadership training? Are
Yeah.
we investing in professional development for our trainers, or do they go through a basic instructor development school with either your agency or your state or your post board or your province or wherever you're from, and then they might go on a 40-hour instructor course to get certified in a system of defensive tactics or firearms? And again, a lot of those are simply advanced student courses, so you do a bunch of reps, but you don't necessarily learn how to teach. And then that's all we do for them. They need to recertify every 3 years, but we're not doing ongoing professional development training in a lot of cases for our trainers. So there's so much of this that I think we need to look at training as a long-term investment in our people and be willing to make the investment rather than seeing training as a whole as a line item and expense.
Yeah. So a couple things on that. I mean, one, I'm curious if you've seen an academy that you think does this really well, that is taking some of these more modern advanced learning principles and applying it to the academy setting. But before that, before I forget, I want to also mention, I said something last week in a conversation that some might find controversial, but I thought, my statement was one of the biggest issues that we have, or something that we need to do away with in law enforcement, is the train the trainer model. And I say that just to kind of capture people's attention. Like, what I really mean is, like, just because somebody has a title trainer doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a good trainer. And sometimes we take people that have technical and tactical proficiencies and they're good at their job, and we say, well, since you're good at your job, we're going to have you teach other people, and then they're a terrible teacher. And for maybe some of the same reasons we just talked about. So I really think this concept of investing in, making sure you're picking the right people that are your trainers, and that I think really applies at the academy level. It's just as important there. I mean, it's equally important, I think, at every step. And the FTOs, I used to, they're the most influential people in any police department. I mean, they're setting the culture, they're setting the future. If your FTOs are not squared away and dialed in, Yeah, you'll know it. You'll know it within 6 months to a year with some of the performance issues that will start popping up with your young officers. But anyway, in terms of the
Absolutely. And
academy,
so, I mean, there's a lot there. So I agree that we need to look at, first of all, selection of people to into training positions. Whether it's, and so if we look at the academy level or academy and in-service instructors, are we selecting people based on who's going to be the best instructor or who's the most skilled in that domain? And as you say, a lot of times what we do is we select the people that are the most skilled, but just because you can do that doesn't mean you can teach it. And the analogy that I use is look at the world of sports. There are very few people in the Hall of Fame as both an athlete and a coach. There are a few, but very, very few. And a lot of the greatest athletes sucked as coaches. And a lot of the great coaches were never great athletes. But they understand the game. They understand how to communicate. They understand motivation. They understand, they have high emotional intelligence, and they have all of these traits that make them great instructors, great coaches, great trainers. And there's a bigger conversation going on worldwide, I think, about coach development and train the trainer, that I think we need to pay attention to and do a better job of developing. And it needs to be a long-term process, right? We can't, what we do is we look at, okay, well, Patrick, you did the 40-hour instructor development class, so you learned how to do perhaps crappy PowerPoints. And I mean, we're still doing things like impromptu speeches that we've been doing for 40 years, where you get forced to talk for 2 minutes about something you know nothing about. I don't want people to do that. I don't want anybody going and talking publicly about something that they know nothing about. And what are people learning and how much time are we spending in that? So instead of doing that 2-minute impromptu, pull some stupid topic out of a hat, let's put people in small groups, give them a couple minutes, say, think about something that is a favorite hobby of yours or a favorite topic of yours or something that you really are passionate about, and then take 2 minutes and explain that to the other two people in your group. Now, instead of us spending 90 minutes doing this impromptu speech, that just what it does is it teaches you who the good BSers are, but it creates a lot of stress for people, and a lot of people struggle with that. And then we're trying to overcome that with the rest of the training. So I think we need to look at instructor development as a long-term process, be continually, and again, that ties in with the research on learning. So if we're just going to do that one, or you take the instructor course and then you only have to recertify every 3 years, your retention of that information is non-existent in 3 years. And especially if you teach once in a while. So if I go back to my former agency, like our unit, the people in our unit were boots on the ground teaching 32 to 40 hours a week, 48 weeks out of the year. There was other instructors in our province that taught 2 or 3 times a year. Well, there's a vast difference between when you're doing it all day, every day, and you're doing it once in a while. And so, we need to look at some of these aspects. So as far as who's doing a good job of it, a couple that come to mind right off the bat, DPSST in Oregon. So in the state of Oregon, there's one single site training facility that every law enforcement officer in the state, including the state police, which is exceptionally rare, goes through that one training facility. It's in Salem, Oregon. It's a very large facility. And they've worked very hard and continued on this journey, but they've worked very hard over the last 7 or 8 years to revamp their curriculum to make sure that it's grounded in and informed by the evidence and the research around learning and training, and how do we do that most effectively. They've also been smart enough to have Stephen James from Washington State University come in on a regular basis and evaluate their training and give them feedback, do some assessments on what's working, what's not working, are we accomplishing what we hope to do, so that they can continually tweak and advance. And then the other is Walter State in Tennessee, and the staff there are doing some really good things, modifying a lot of their training, but they're continually looking at what is the evidence, what is the research, what does the research say, and then how do we apply that? Now, there's other pockets around North America. The challenge that a lot of trainers have is very few trainers have the ability to influence the entire curriculum. So there are pockets where, say, defensive tactics or officer safety instructors or firearms instructors are working to apply, make sure that how they teach and their piece of it is grounded in and informed by the research. But very few trainers have the ability to influence the entire curriculum. The other element is if you look at, the 700 state and local training academies in the U.S., and I don't know how many academies there would be in Canada, obviously not near that many, but a number of the ones in the U.S., especially, and some of the Canadian ones, are regional academies. So the individual agencies have little influence over how that academy is run. And I've talked to people who say, we do not like the way that the regional academy is run. But if we raise a stink about it, they tell us, okay, well, fine, go find someplace else, train your people. And there isn't any place. So what agencies are forced to do, I know agencies that have a pre-academy training with recruits to give them some tools to deal with the crap they're going to deal with in the academy. And then they have a post-academy training with the recruits before they go to FTO phase to undo some of the damage done at the academy. So there are some agencies that are doing some really good things from an in-service perspective, like Abbotsford Police Service out the west coast of Canada. They are the entire training cadre are people that when they go to training, they come back and they implement what they learned, and they're continually finding ways to implement what they learned. The skills area in my former agency, the Calgary Police Service, are doing some really, really good things. John Warren, the sergeant there, is one of the best trainers and leaders that you'll ever meet. So there are pockets of around North America where agencies are doing some really good things. Scottsdale, Arizona, and Chandler, Arizona do some really good things with their in-service training. But again, there's so many academies, such variety in how they're being run, that's one of the challenges for a lot of trainers.
Yeah. And maybe I got a little bit ahead of myself in this conversation, but now that we're here, I want to stay here for a little bit. And this is a great conversation. When in my last couple of years, I served in Indiana. I was a governor appointee for what they call the Law Enforcement Training Board. So I was a chief that represented the mid-sized police departments in Indiana, and so I did. When you're a young recruit and you're in the academy, I had come out of the military and then went to college before I went to the academy. So I was older, had a little bit of life underneath my belt. So the paramilitary style, it never really, that didn't really impact me much. But I definitely found it interesting to watch people, even like men in their late 20s, early 30s that had never been exposed to that type of environment. I mean, they really struggled. Like they were on pins and needles, and so you would have these conversations like, "Hey, man, just relax. Like it's going to be fine." But that's easy to say, but you see how it's impacting their ability to learn and their ability to. But you said something also that I want to touch on, and this is, I think, a problem nationwide is. In police departments, we all think like that we're training our officers the best way. Like our trainers are proud, in many cases, they're really good. We send them to the academy and then we joke about this when they come back, we're going to have to deprogram them and we're going to have to retrain them. And so I always kept that in the back of my mind when I was in those law enforcement training board meetings. And then I got to see the other side of it. Like, here's what the staff at an academy is trying to manage, where a police department might be sending one officer a year to the academy, or a bigger one might be sending 10, 20 to the academy. They're all coming to the academy with different life experiences, with different skill sets. They've been vetted in 25 different ways. Yep. And, the expectation for chiefs and sheriffs is everybody makes it through, or we wouldn't have sent them to you if we didn't think they could do the job. So there's all these disparate ideas about what makes a good cop and what creates good training, what is a good training environment. So I wonder if, like, nationwide, and I'm not going to say federal police force because people will flip out, but I do think that there would be some benefit to what you're saying, these pockets of success, these pockets of what we're doing really well, if we had maybe it's IADLIST or another organization that takes all of these best practices, they see the things that are working well, and then we have a national curriculum for basic level law enforcement, not state level, not local level, not these regional academies, but listen, these are the base skills that we need every police officer to do and to do very well. And this is what we want to teach in the academy. And then outside of that, or at least set the foundation, like, because you can't master anything in 3 months or 4 months. So you can get familiar with it. Really hard to master anything in that short a period of time. But from there, maybe we start building out. I don't know. I mean,
I think first of all, if trainers, most trainers are doing the best they can with the tools they have.
Yeah.
And the reality for all of us is we don't know what we don't know. And so, but again, we don't send people to. So I think that the premier event for law enforcement trainers is the ILETA conference, the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association, which is an association for trainers, and then it holds a world-class conference every year. So for the last number of years, the ILETA conference has been in St. Louis. So there are trainers from around the U.S., Canada, and other places in the world that come every year that talk about what is on the cutting edge, what is on the leading edge, and then how do we take this research and the science, because that's the challenge. So Mark Williams is a sport and performance psychologist, and one of the things that Mark explained to me is he said, coaching is an art that can be informed by the science, but it's an art that can be informed by the science, but it's largely experimental and experiential. And so what we need to look at is, this is why I will use the term. I don't think that what we do in training is evidence-based. I think it's grounded in and informed by the research. But if you look at the massive body of research, very little of it is specific to policing. And of that, very little of that is done in an applied setting, so that there's a direct link between this and performance in the field. And then again, a lot of that's done in more of those applied settings. They say this is what we observe, but there's not necessarily actionable things for trainers. So one of the challenges for trainers is, how do you take all of this information that's in the research around learning, teaching, training, coaching, facilitating, developing, and then how do we apply that to make it applicable and relevant to our profession, and then to our people within our profession? Because again, as you well know, I mean, it's very different. The needs for policing for somebody who's working in a 5 or 6 officer agency are very different than people that are working in 1,000 or 2,000 or 36,000 officer agency. People that are working, in sheriff's offices, highway patrol, state police, RCMP, provincial police, those type of, where they're very often by themselves and backup is a long, long ways away. That's perhaps a different skill set, or there are different things that they need. Now, I think we could go down to critical, but when you talk about those foundational skills, the things that come to me are decision-making, problem solving, critical thinking, emotional intelligence, listening skills, communication skills, those skills. Yet many would argue, if you look at foundational skills, it's around shooting, fighting, response to active killer events, technical and tactical skills. Yeah. But I think if we step away from the terminology hard and soft skills and talk about technical and tactical skills, which we would historically call hard skills, and instead of talking about soft skills because we set them aside because they're soft, is talk about skills that are based around relationships and human connection, because that's a lot of what our job is. So, but are we teaching critical thinking, decision-making, problem-solving, communication in those academies? My belief is a goal of trainers and training is to help our people to become dexterous, adaptable, and resilient problem solvers. And resilience not only in their ability to deal with challenges that they face in the profession, but resilient in their decision making. so that if what I decide to do isn't working, that I have the ability to move on to something else and switch to something else. But that requires that we train in a certain way. And we're starting to see, and there's some great training that's been going on for 35, 40 years or longer. So it's not like these are new things. So we're seeing new labels and people putting stuff in buckets. But some of this, I've been to training that there's been great training going on for a long time, some very innovative trainers. But I think we need to take a step back and look at some of these and what are the critical skills in the profession. And I think where we get ourselves into trouble is very rarely the technical, tactical skills. It's in the decision-making piece. So do we teach people decision-making? Do we teach them how to perform under pressure and train that critical thinking, that problem solving? And that's a way of thinking about how we deliver training that is different from some of the things that we currently do.
Yeah. What's the old was it George Clinton, sang the song like free your mind and your ass will follow. I think I always remember that line from Platoon when one of the characters in there says that free your mind and your ass will follow. And I come back to that often because it really, I think that kind of encapsulates what you're saying. When you open up your mind and you have the willingness and the ability to learn, adapt, experiment, and be flexible in your thinking, then and I think these are skills that can be taught. I mean, it's not like they're not. I think they are malleable. I think for some people it's easier than others, and again, coming back to like having a good coach to point these things out and help guide you, which that we could have a whole nother episode on just that alone, right?
Well, I think that goes to what are we training though? So
Yeah.
I agree that these are all skills. So all those things that I listed are skills. And so if we look at them as skills and they can be learned, they can be developed, but we need to continue to develop them throughout people's careers. But part of this goes back to why some of the mental skills training is so important right from the start. And then we talk to people about mindsets because everybody comes into this profession with a mindset, but mindsets are malleable. So mindsets are, the definition I use from Davy Gray is that mindsets are core beliefs that serve as lenses that will influence our future and guide our future thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and actions. So those beliefs, my belief about my ability to learn, new information. Do I have a growth mindset? So I believe that if I'm willing to do the work, then I can get better, I can improve. Not that you can be anything you want to be, but if I'm willing to do the work, I can get better. Or do I have a fixed mindset where I believe that these things are fixed at birth? What's my mindset around stress? That do I see stress as bad, stress as debilitating, and which is kind of the message that people get hammered with today in society as a whole, and certainly in training. And we need to flip that to stress is facilitating. Stress is the response of the brain that's manifested in the body to demands in the environment. And stress is designed to help you to be successful, to overcome whatever those demands are. So if we think differently about stress, if we think differently about things like anxiety, understand that anxiety is natural and normal. It's always future focused, and it's always about something that's important to the individual. So if we understand those things, and then we understand the concepts of challenge versus threat states, and I see this event in the future as a challenge, something that's difficult but doable, then I'm going to do the work to make sure that I'm prepared. If I see it as a threat, something that's unmanageable, that I'm incapable of doing, then I'm going to engage in avoidance behavior. So I think if we address the mindset piece early and often, then they start to understand that these things are malleable. I can shift these mindsets. So I can learn these skills that what I've been programmed for in the past is it doesn't have to be my current reality and my reality moving forward. So I think all of these things come together and are absolutely critical. We need to prepare the mind and the body for where they may have to go. And so we tend to do a very good job of preparing the body some cases, but we don't spend enough time helping to prepare the mind for where the body may have to go. And these things are intricately linked.
Yes, and that's a perfect segue into, I think, what we were originally planning on talking about. It only took us an hour to get here, but that was a fun that's a fun conversation. The uh, the body is I don't know if are you familiar with Bessel van der Kolk's work, The Body Keeps Score. It's
Yep.
an amazing book, but I think it should be mandatory reading. Like I have probably a lot of books that I think should be mandatory reading for police officers, but that's definitely high on the list because it just talks about how the body can accumulate and hold stress. But like you mentioned earlier, there is this big misunderstanding about what stress is, and people walk around saying, "Oh, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed," and it's like, well, are you really stressed, or are you stuck, or are you in a position where you just don't have the right tools, the right framework to manage the problem that is in front of you? And
Yep.
if we kind of take that bigger picture and then like use an officer, their performance as an example, why do some officers under extremely stressful situations, let's say an active assault, with a knife or with gunfire, multiple things going on, why can some officers navigate those situations successfully, not demonstrating, or outwardly at least, a what appears to be a high level of stress, whereas others might be faced with something that might not even be deemed as a stressful incident for others, but to them, their stress levels, the reaction is maybe disproportionate to the problem that they're facing, and then they shut down. I think most cops are familiar with the vernacular and the terminology around, tunnel vision and all these things, that the physical effects on stress on body. But it really kind of boils down to, emotional regulation, emotional dysregulation. And I'll go a little bit further back because you said something that I like to tell people a lot, right? Competence breeds confidence. Like when you're competent in something, then you're going to have a high level of confidence, or I should say more confidence that you'll be successful when the time comes to use whatever that competent skill is. If you have low competence, you can't hide from that. And I think that's, so yeah, I mean, it's a big subject, and there's a lot of things that we could discuss in that. But one of the things I wanted to chat with you about, because you mentioned it in our pre-call a little bit different, right? Stephen Kotler calls this the challenge skills balance, where when in a training environment, or in in law enforcement, we call it training, and maybe we should call it practice. Instead of going to training, we're going to practice. I don't know. If you're trying to attempt, and Kotler comes from the extreme sports world on human performance. Like, why do people continually keep pushing the boundaries on what we think is possible? And why do other people fail at really what would others might consider like a baseline task? In that practice environment, that challenge skills environment, it's really comes down to that competence and confidence. If we try to ask someone to do too much too soon, they're very likely going to fail. And if they fail, they're going to limit their beliefs about what they think is possible. So in a training environment, we want to dose appropriately. Dose with what we think somebody can handle. Once they demonstrate that they can handle it, maybe we give them just a little bit more and just continually just nudge the boundaries until over time we've expanded their beliefs on what's possible and what's not possible, rather than crushing them right up front. So you had a different way of and you sent me a few papers, and that's kind of what I want you to talk about for a couple minutes on why that's so important. You call it the challenge point theory, and maybe take a few minutes to explain that.
Yeah, so there's a lot in what you talked about, right? And the reason we see these differences is historically what we've heard is train the way you want to fight and you're going to fight the way we train. And then, but we don't see everybody come out of training. You didn't see that in the military. Everybody come out of basic training and perform at the same levels. We don't see it in policing or law enforcement or any other domain. And so the key is we need to train with imagination and emotion, and we need to train in the appropriate skills. So if you look at something like, so we take that mindset piece and we understand that. So we start working at that early to help people to develop their mindset. And regardless of how good their mindset already is, it can continue to be enhanced. So, I mean, I was having this conversation 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, with a group of high performance athletes, one of whom was training for their third Olympics. Another one was a current world champion, and it was all the way from that level to people that were relatively new in that particular sport. But again, it's these mindset skills are something that they can all build on. So then we go back. So then we understand the challenge versus threat states that we talked about. If I see these things as a challenge, and then, so if we look at challenge point theory, so the original paper on challenge point theory was written in 2004 by Tim Lee and Mark Wardignola. And basically what it said is there's a sweet spot for training. And it's when we train at the outer edges of our skill level that's where that learning takes place. So, and then there's some more recent papers by Nicola Hodges and Keith Lowe's on taking that challenge point theory and advancing it. And again, they talk about that's the learning zone, is when we're training at the outer edges of our skill level. So in that, if we put people in those situations, the key is that and again, I think language is important. So just as a quick aside, I think we need to stop talking about law enforcement as a paramilitary profession, because we're not. Like if you look up the definition for paramilitary, it's not law enforcement. And you do a Google search on paramilitary organizations, they're not law enforcement. So we're a different animal than the military. But so if we go back to this, the key for that is to put people in situations, so that learning zone where they're at the appropriate level of challenge, kind of the Goldilocks zone for learning, is where people are going to struggle. So this goes back to mindset. What we need people to understand from a learning mindset is struggle is natural and normal. As Dr. Andrew Huberman says, is if there is no friction, if there is no struggle, there is no learning. In order for neuroplasticity to take place, that rewiring of the brain to take place, there has to be some friction, there has to be some struggle. So this becomes important for people to understand, because a lot of people are of the mindset that if I'm struggling, then I suck at this, I'll probably never learn this, I'll never get this. That's programming that they bring with them from a lifetime into the profession. That comes from coaches, comes from teachers, comes from parents, teammates, siblings, from a whole bunch of places. So we need them to understand that, you know what, we're going to put you in situations where you're going to struggle, and you're just going to have to work through it and solve that problem. We're going to give you problems that are difficult, but they're doable, they're solvable. And those problems are going to increase in complexity and challenge as we move throughout the training. So we're going to put them in these situations. Now, the key for trainers is that we need to let go of our desire to be anal about technique and have it look like something beautiful, because it's not. But we're going to put them in situations. We're going to teach them principles and concepts, things like balance, power, mobility, and then how to maximize those for themselves, how to disrupt those in the subject. And then we'll put them in situations where they use those principles and concepts to solve a variety of problems. And those problems are going to increase in complexity and challenge as they go. And so, again, the challenge for trainers is this goes back to the art of training. Is nobody can tell you how much time to spend in that appropriate that learning zone. One of the things that Hodges and Lowe's point out in their research is that struggle, training in that zone, while it's ideal for learning, it also comes with a psychological and an emotional and a motivational cost. So it can't be all struggle all the time. There's times where we need to back off and do things that are just perhaps more blocked and silo training to build up people's confidence a little bit. It's not necessarily going to be good for learning, but it's going to be good for confidence. And so the challenge to trainers is to figure out, as a result of their experience and with different officers and training in different groups, where's that sweet spot? But this is why we need to figure out, how do we pull all of these things together and incorporate it into our training? Because if the training model is just do what you're told, and if you're struggling, I'm always going to give you the answer, then what you learn is you're dependent. You learn to be dependent on me to give you the answer. And I'm not going to be there in the street. And so when we see people that have the ability to function in these pressure environments, some of them have had a lot of experience performing in those pressure environments. They've trained in certain ways. Some of them have had good coaches along the way, and it might have been in sports or in other elements, or because they were taught differently at the academy, or they came in with a different mindset. So again, all of these things come together. So this is why we need to look at, what does some of this research say, and then figure out, how do we apply this? And again, if we look at some of the principles of variability in training, and I think we need to step away from talking about failure in training and just have people understand that they're going to spend some time struggling to fix the problem. We're going to give them problems that are difficult, but they're doable. We're going to give them challenges, and we're going to keep using that language and let them work through these challenges and solve these problems. And then as a result, over time, they learn to become that dexterous, adaptable, and resilient problem solvers. So when they get out in the street and now they're thrust into new and novel situations that are not like they were in training, because a lot of times they're not going to be, then they have the ability to stay calm and work through it. So again, this is why the mental side is so critical. This is why things like imagery are such a powerful tool, because we can give people the best tactics, equipment, and kit in the world, and if their mind shuts down, then all that stuff is useful.
Yep.
So if we're not preparing the mind and the body for where they may have to go together, then we're doing our people a disservice. And then when they don't perform at the level that they should, instead of getting mad at them, what we need to do as trainers is step back and say, what piece of this do I own? Because we probably own a big piece of it.
Yeah, that we call that the fundamental attribution error, right? Where we blame people and individuals for systems problems, where like we don't set them up for success. And I think we're bad at that in policing overall. Always, I mean, that's just kind of, maybe that's a bit of a unfair statement, because when you think about what 50 million contacts nationwide every year, I mean, what we would really evaluate and judge as extremely poor performance, just a small fraction. But with all that said, there is so much room for improvement. And I can't help but to think, when I start hearing, take this comprehensive approach, because that's where optimization occurs, is when the mind and body do meet with you. So you've got the person that's been prepared by others, they've prepared themselves, they've been equipped well, they've been trained well, and they've been put into a position to succeed. When you go back to watching body camera footage and evaluating performance from that neutral third party perspective, like how did we do throughout the entire call? Where did we do well? What are points for performance improvement, what's unsatisfactory, or whatever terminology you would want to say. I mean, because we have a lot of really good we have successful outcomes with bad processes, You know,
Yes.
and sometimes we look at that as a success when we really should look at that as a learning opportunity. Like, um,
And I think we need to do a better job of that, right? And so
yeah,
Sidney Dekker, one of the leading experts in the world in human error, says you can blame or you can learn, but you can't do both. So we tend to often be good at blaming and not at learning. And as you said, not looking at the system. What is there in their system, the training, the equipment, those things. You know, I'd encourage people to read the book Black Box Thinking about how, you know, where it talks about we as a policing profession and the medical community as well are not very good at learning from close calls, near misses, and errors and mistakes, whereas other industries like transportation, aviation, oil and gas, mining tend to be far better at learning from close calls, near misses, and from bad outcomes, and then changing the system because they look at it from a systems perspective. So I think if
yeah,
we look at that, I think the other piece, and I love the term they use, the term optimize. And I think this is what we need to understand. I read something recently that generally it's our ego that gets in the way of learning. And so this is not to suggest, and I come across sometimes perhaps too aggressively with this, but I'm not suggesting that trainers are doing anything ill-intended. I think most trainers are doing the best they can with what they know and the tools that they have. And it's not that what we're doing is wrong. It's what can we do to optimize? What can we do to make our training more optimal? So I agree with you that given all the complexity of the nature of policing, all the complexity of, and again, if you look at the world of human error and, you know, the big foreign complexity with things like, visibility of the problem and time constraints and novelty of the problem and goal conflicts, we experience those all the time. And yet they say that if you experience any one of those four in any profession, it increases the likelihood of human error. So our people do a really good job with the complexity of what we deal with. We just need to figure out how do we continue to optimize what we're doing. And I'm not suggesting that we scrap everything that we're doing, but I love the question from Dr. Robert Cooper, a neuroscientist that I borrowed a long time ago. That is, where is the smallest change you can make that would make the biggest difference? Where is the smallest change you can make that make the biggest difference? So I think as trainers, if we think like scientists and we put together a well-formed hypothesis based on everything that we've learned in our anecdotal experience and talking to other trainers, and then we run an experiment, a small experiment to test that hypothesis. And we make this change in training. And then we run it and we assess over time and we iterate. And then we run another experiment. And then we run another experiment. But just what can we do to make small changes? Like I said, very few people have the ability to redo the entire curriculum. That's a massive undertaking, and you need the infrastructure that's going to support that. But we can all look at what we do and ask that question, where might the smallest change make the biggest difference? So what can we do? And again, are we continuing to find ways to apply what we're learning? Are we going to events like ILEADA? Are we reading? Are we listening to podcasts like yours? Are we exploring some of these different areas and then figuring out how do I apply that? And understanding, and we're seeing some great advances, right? Stress, we've talked about stress a couple times. Stress is almost impossible to measure. Now there is technology now, and again, through the company Neurosmart, Dr. Melise Yilmaz-Balban is doing some great work
yeah,
to look at that stress reactivity. But again, it's, you know, we've confused for years heart rate with performance, and there's no correlation. And as Melise says, high heart rate is simply an indicator of arousal of the nervous system. High heart rate is not an indicator of emotional or cognitive overload, because we can see people, and Dr. Bill Lewinsky from Force Science has been talking about this for a long time. We see people perform at very high levels with very high heart rates, contrary to what we may have been told historically. So can we look at some of these things? But again, are we giving people tools to mitigate that in the moment And is this something that we're weaving through training throughout? Are we giving them simple, applicable tools? Are we giving them options? So multiple breathing options, say, and different ways to use imagery and other elements, and then letting them figure out as they go through training and they go throughout their careers, when is it applicable to use this tool? When might this tool might be more beneficial? How can I modify this so it best works for me? So there's a lot to this, but I think the key for trainers is to look at the system, to do what you can to educate yourself, and then to look to make small changes, a series of small changes, and run a series of experiments and test some of these hypotheses to figure out what's going to work for your people in your training.
Yeah, so that's maybe, and I think here this might be a fun way to tie all of this together. Let's just do like a little thought experiment as for our last 20 minutes or so here. So Dr. Balbon, she's been a guest on the podcast previously, but we talked about Neurosmart. But for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a device that you wear on your arm, and it can detect moisture in the skin as your skin. I think that's how it works. Like as your body becomes stressed,
the galvanic skin response. Yeah.
Yes. And it's the fastest way to detect, and I guess to date, well, like one of the most accurate ways to detect like that there is a stress response that's occurring in the body. So you wear it on your arm. Now, this is, and so of all the things that we've talked about today, this is what I love about her technology, is because when we're trying to understand what works and what doesn't work, sometimes from a training perspective, we might blame a trainer for using a technique that's not successful when it's really the learner that is failing to adopt or adapt to some of the principles. Now, maybe it's both, right? Maybe it's the individual that's stuck at a certain point. But either way, right? All that matters, like if someone's going through a training scenario and they're not having success, then we have to figure out a way to make them successful. We don't want to we don't want to fail somebody, quote, fail them and discard them, because like I'll even go back to even a more simple example. Like we have some people that just have a extreme difficult time qualifying with their firearm. For a lot of reasons. I think a lot of it, I mean, it's almost all psychological because the physical skills are there. So there's a psychological barrier somewhere, whether their mind is already forward thinking, like you were talking about, outcomes based, where they can't focus on the process because they're too worried about the future. This is where like technology, and I do, sometimes I'm not a total technology geek, but I like wear my Whoop strap. I wear a headset when I meditate, my Muse headset. I track data points, and it's not because I look at these data points that they're going to give me exact information. It's so over time, when I see trends, when things start trending in a way that is improvement, I'm like, okay, what am I doing? And we talked a little bit on our pre-call about HRV. HRV is probably not a great measure for like a great measurement tool for short-term performance issues, but for overall health, it over time, as long as you're looking at your own numbers and not comparing yourself to others, because it's highly individualistic, then you can learn a lot about what your daily habits are, how your lifestyle, the things that you're doing every day, how they're impacting you over time. And I think as a profession, we can learn from this and begin to use some of these modern technologies that can actually help us understand what's working and what's not working, and create more individualistic training. Slow the training down for some people. And this is where the big challenges get in, right? Because let's go back to, let's just say we're going to run 100 people through whether like AU Fire's simulator, right? That's a great simulator. There's a lot of really good ones out there. That one's just the first one that popped to mind because it's got a pain. I don't know if they call it like a pain penalty system, like where you actually get hit and you feel pain in the simulation. But it's like like using simunitions in a scenario based training. But if you bring in let's just say 100 recruits, and they run through the scenario, if you have a recruit that has spent 5 years in combat, they're probably going to respond a little bit differently in that training environment than someone that has never, like, this is like they're 21, they're 22, they've never been in a fist fight, they've never been in a real altercation, and now they have to go navigate this, right? The stress response is probably going to be different. The performance is going to be different. But when you've got 100 people in there and we're trying to run 100 people through these scenarios, and if we try to evaluate them all in the same way, then that's not fair to the people that are new to this exposure. And we might not, and for the people that are on the higher end, we may not be challenging them enough. So, we kind of take this middle of the road approach. And where I see the opportunity for technologies like that is on a case by case basis. We get to evaluate. And then whether you're experienced, whether you're a 20-year SWAT officer or a 2-year patrol officer, or, a recruit in training, when you use technology that provides feedback like this, you may detect something that's trending in a direction that you like, or conversely that you don't like. So there might be days where you realize, like, man, I'm really struggling in these scenarios today. I don't know why. Now we have an opportunity to kind of take a step back and reflect. But I know that's a lot, but that's kind of where I just wanted to use this one piece of technology, because if you find someone that is struggling, this is where all the techniques and all of the, I think all of the research that we're learning today, this is where we start that plug and play process at an individual level, and we create success, whether it's day one or day 1,000. We create just a little bit of improvement today over where we were yesterday. And I think if we look at the profession like this as a whole, wow, like it gets exciting to think about, like, how good we could actually we could be in policing.
Yeah, and I think the key is to take some of that technology like Neurosmart, but then look at, so I like the philosophy. I subscribe to the philosophy of Lisa Feldman Barrett, the neuroscientist, where she says everything goes through the brain. So, and so if we look at this and we look at people's response, that's why, I think that's what stress is the nonspecific response of the brain manifested in the body to demands made upon it in the environment. So what we're going to see is, when we see these different spikes, when we see these different levels of performance, when we see somebody that's struggling, it's generally a mental block. I agree with firearms that all it is it's a mental block. They can shoot. It's test anxiety. It's test anxiety around firearms qualification, and their biggest fear, what they're anxious about, is they're anxious about failing in front of their peers and being embarrassed in front of their peers. That's a pretty easy fix if you understand how to do performance enhancement imagery. And we did that a lot with recruits, and we had a lot of success in overcoming that mental barrier to qualification. But this is why it's important that we start early with the mental skills training. Let me give you an example. So one of the people I interviewed for the Excellence in Training Academy is Christian Niederbull, who recently earned his PhD in sport and performance psychology. Christian is a former Norwegian military sniper with multiple combat tours as a sniper and a sniper team leader. One part of the research he did for his PhD dissertation was the integration of mental skills into the advanced sniper course for the Norwegian military. So in order to get on that course, you have to pass the basic sniper course. He said that the advanced sniper course is one of the most challenging courses that they have in the entire Norwegian military. There are 163 tests in 7 weeks. And so what he wanted to see is if we incorporated mental skills training early, things like imagery, self-talk, breathing techniques, goal setting, things like that, and wove it into everything that they did throughout the entire 7 weeks, gave them options and let them figure out how to use these various options, but integrated it throughout. what might be the result. Now, he said, my hypothesis going in is that we were not going to improve their shootings. And he said a lot of people raise their eyebrows at that, but he said our instructors are the best of the best. So I didn't think we were going to improve their shooting skills. That's not where they struggle. They struggle in performing under pressure and decision making. Now, he's very quick to say, he said, I'm not claiming causation for the results. But he said for the first time in the history of this course, and we have data going back for a long time, for the first time in the history of the course, everybody passed. The standards remained as high as they ever were. The challenges were as high as they always have been. So they did not lower the standards at all. But when they integrated these mental skills early and made them part of this, for the first time in the history of the course, everybody passed. Now, just an aside, Christian says that he believes that if we were to do this at the start of people's careers at the basic level and integrate it, that it would serve a preventative function for some of the downstream mental health issues that we have as professions in the military and law enforcement. So I think we do some of this early. Then if we see an individual struggling and we want to individualize stuff, now again, there's something we can tie in with. We can use imagery along with the data from Neurosmart, and there's all kinds of things that we can do very specifically with that. There's all kinds of ways to integrate imagery and the Neurosmart technology to enhance performance, to help people with reintegrating back in after a critical event or after they've been off for a long term. So I think we take some of that great new technology, but we integrate it with mental skills that have been around for a long time.
Yeah.
And this is where this all comes together to enhance performance.
Yeah, I love it. And because, and again, for those that might not be, maybe you don't understand what we're talking about here, like really it's just a device that you wear on your arm while you're going through these training devices, and it gives a feedback to you basically get a readout that shows what your different stress levels are doing in your body. So what you can then do is compare your performance in the scenario to what your stress levels. So you might find, like, if it's a point where you have to make a decision whether you're going to shoot or not shoot, your stress levels may have gone really high, and maybe you missed the target at that same moment. So you can kind of compare, what your performance looked like with your actual stress levels while you were going through that scenario. So then you can start to evaluate, like, okay, well, was the scenario too difficult for this person? Did we not build them up enough, or is there something else going on with this person that is causing them to miss shots in that moment? And it's also important to understand, like, some people may show really high levels of stress in that moment, but also have really high levels of performance.
Yes.
So they're performing through the stress. And there's a lot of different ways that you can look at this, and I think all positive, but it could be.
Yeah, and I think if a couple things there, and it's a great explanation, but the one added piece is that you can link the Neurosmart system to a cell phone. Then you mount the cell phone where the officer's body camera would be.
Yes.
So it's recording from the body cam perspective. And so you can match the video to the link from the Neurosmart. So you can see exactly what's happening in the scenario. Now, a caveat with that is we need to look at some of the latest research, one of the latest research papers by Force Science, that shows there's a huge disconnect between what's captured on an in-car body cam or an officer's body camera and what the officer is visually attending to that's driving their decisions. So in that research, they had eye tracking glasses on the officers, so they knew what they were visually attending to. Most of these things we don't. So now if we had eye trackers as well as that camera, as well as the Neurosmart, we could pull all of these things together. But even with without the eye tracker. So we need to understand that caveat from the phone is capturing what the body camera was capturing. That's not telling us what the officer was attending to. So then this is where the debriefing skills afterwards come in. So I sit down with me as the officer, and you're looking at the video, and this is happening in the video. You're looking at this spike, and now you could ask me some questions. Okay, Brian, so going into this scenario, so what was your goals going in? How did you prioritize? What predictions did you make going in about what you might encounter a subject's behavior? As this was happening here, what were you attending to? Where was your attention when this was going on? Because the only way you'll know what I'm attending to is to ask me, unless you have eye tracking glasses on. And even with that, you know what I'm visually attending to, but you don't necessarily know what's going on in my head. And then you can ask me, okay, so I was attending to this. Okay, what did that mean to you? So how did you make sense out of that? And then what decisions did you make? And then what problems did you have to solve? So now we tie these debriefing skills in with what were in the video and with the Neurosmart technology. Now we get a sense as to what's going on in the officer's head. Because a couple of key things. Number one is, as Dr. Paul Taylor says, is human beings will always pay attention to what's important to them in the moment. And as Gareth Locke from the Human Diver Project says, is it will always make sense to the individual to do what they did in the moment. We just need to figure out why. So when we tie together the debriefing skills, what's captured on the video with what the Neurosmart is telling us, now we can figure out what strategies, whether it's imagery or some other strategies, to help that officer to improve their performance. So I think this is where all of these things come together. And so this is why it's so difficult for trainers, and there's so much on trainers. But this is why, if we can start to figure out how to connect all these dots, then this is how we help people, the individual officers, to optimize their performance.
And from those individuals, I think that's how we scale over time, because we'll learn what works, what doesn't work, what works well for some. And you can learn a lot from things, because it might even be something as simple as, hey, I've used this technology for the last year, 2 years, and today I performed really poorly. So when you're going through that briefing process and debriefing process, it might be something as simple as, I just got off a 24-hour shift and I came to do training. But I haven't slept in a day and a half, or or maybe when I was at a wedding this weekend and made poor lifestyle decisions, whatever it might be. The individual over time begins to learn what impacts performance. And then when you're working in teams and environments like that, where you learn that, hey, today, that self-awareness that you can develop from these types of technologies, like, hey, look, and I've looked at it as even from a supervisor perspective, like, I'm hoping that someday we can get to the point where we say, look, hey, you're going to work the desk today. We're going to put you in a low stress environment. Your quote readiness score, however you want to look at it, doesn't indicate to us today that you're in an optimal state to go out and perform. It opens up a lot of doors for a lot of other questions, but I think when it comes to just that individual performance and optimization, things like the feedback like this can help us understand how sleep impacts us, how nutrition impacts us, how a daily meditation or mindfulness practice might impact us, or how we're managing finance and how we're managing relationships, and how are we spending time training, all of those things. And then, like, you'll know when you're feeling good and you're ready to perform, and you'll also know when you might have to put yourself on high alert, like that really, and I know this really just what we're describing here is high levels of, or higher or improving levels of emotional intelligence. And
Well,
It's
it's
just
you
all so
mentioned something
important.
about readiness scores, and I've heard that from a number of athletic trainers where when they're working with high performance athletes, they'll have them do this readiness score at the start of training. So how is their sleep? What else has been going on? So, and I think as trainers in the academy, we need to be paying attention to this. So are we doing these scenarios at the latter part of the week? Earlier that day, they got smoked with a really hard PT session. They had a bunch of really challenging defensive tactics. Then they had a midterm exam, and now they're coming to us and they're already absolutely fatigued from a hard week. Their stress level is high from everything that's going on. And that's going to impact performance, right? Where is their sleep in some of these? So I think there's a lot that we can start to pull together these things. Again, it can appear to be overwhelming. So that goes back to just where's the smallest change that you can make that would make the biggest difference. Start small and just work to continually evolve and continually optimize what you're doing to help your people optimize their performance in a very complex and challenging profession.
All right, and let's close it out with one more. I have one more question for you, and I really like this concept. Some may be doing it, but this, if you here's hopefully you've gotten a lot of great takeaways from this conversation today. But you mentioned something to me about an innovative. We were talking about innovative training models and different approaches to training. As an administrator, and as a former chief. I do think it's critically important for us to, the future of policing is in our investment in our people and in our training. Yep. Equipment is always going to be required. We're going to need stuff like that. But the most important investment we need to make is in the training environment. We have to prepare people properly. And you had mentioned, along those lines really, but you had mentioned that there was, after you go through training, like what we just talked about with Neurosmart and other things, when we learn little things, incorporating training into every day, you had a concept of the 10-minute daily training.
Yep.
So maybe touch on what I said about investment in training, and then finish with how you teach 10-minute training, and then we'll close it out for the day.
Excellent. So I think we need to look at training as an investment in the development of our people. Our people need to be our number one priority. So we need to invest in them. We need to train them. So that is an ongoing investment, making daily deposits in their skills and abilities and competence and confidence, and their abilities around things like decision making and solving problems and critical thinking. So one way to do that, if you look at some of the research, one of the key elements to make learning stick is spaced repetition. So we need to space this learning out or training out. And so my position is, if we take 10 minutes every day, and you did 10 minutes at the start of every shift that was around training, and you can do a decision training exercise. There's a whole multitude of ways that you can do this, but we spend 10 minutes. And so people say, well, big deal. What's 10 minutes? Well, 10 minutes a day, 4 days a week, 48 weeks out of the year is an extra 32 hours of training a year. So I was talking to one chief recently, and I said, Chief, so if I said to you, Patrick, as a chief, you need to come up with 32 hours, an extra 32 hours for training a year. You're going to roll your head, shake your eyes, and say, Willis, get out. But 10 minutes a day, 4 days a week, 48 weeks out of the year is 32 hours of training a year. And now we're doing a lot, which is consistent with the research on learning. Now, here's the other piece of that. So we have a 10-minute conversation at shift brief or roll call. And maybe we're watching just a snippet of a video and say, okay, if this was to happen to us, if we were to encounter this, or when we encounter this, what could we do? So the word could implies there's multiple options. So let's have a conversation. So we brainstorm for 8 or 9 minutes, and we're having a good conversation. And I say, okay, well, 10 minutes is up. Let's go out, check the pin maps, hit the streets. Let's go out and do some work. And so, but what's going to happen now is, over the course of the shift, they're going to continue to think about it. They're going to talk about it on their breaks. They might have to look up a policy or look up a law. But now that 10 minutes of training at the start of shift turned into 30, 60, or 90 minutes of self-directed learning and reflection throughout their shift. And then we carried on the next day, and then we do the next day. And now what we're doing is we're continually having these conversations, and we're now developing these skills around critical thinking, problem solving. People start to understand what policy says, the applications of policy. We understand that when we have certain events, now we're all in the same, we have a shared mental model about how we're going to deal with this particular problem. And so it's going to help us now. Again, we're not locked in anything. We have the ability to problem solve. But again, just little things. That's why I say just think about where might the smallest change. 10 minutes a day, 4 days a week, 48 weeks out of the year, 32 hours of training a year. 10 minutes a day, 5 days a week is 40 hours a year. So you tack that 32 to 40 hours on to what you're already doing, and now we can see massive improvements in people's thinking and skills and knowledge, competence and confidence.
I love it. I love it. And for those that are out there, if you're looking at the people around you that always seem to have the right answers, that always seem to be successful, that always seem to be in the right place at the right time, it's because they're doing these things or something similar. So partner up with them, hang out with the people that are going to lift you up, avoid the people that are going to drag you down, and make a commitment to being lifelong learners. And really, I think finding the joy in learning and the excitement that comes with, these discoveries of new technologies, new ways of doing things. I like to say, like, your eyes are always forward out into the future with your feet firmly planted on the ground underneath of you. So
and the key is then to take action on what you're learning. There's a quote from Maya Angelou: do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better.
Do better. I love that. I really, really appreciate your time. This has been a fantastic conversation. For people that are interested in learning more about you, what you're, maybe to bring you in for training, how can people get a hold of you? What's the best way to dive in?
So my main website is winningmindtraining.com, winningmindtraining.com. I also have another site that's a membership site for law enforcement trainers, excellenceandtrainingacademy.com. Or people can just send me an email at winningmind@mac.com. So winningmind@mikealphacharlie.com. So those are probably the best ways to reach out and connect.
Awesome. And I know you always have a lot of great comments and content out there on LinkedIn as well for people that are on LinkedIn. Sir, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I learned a lot today. I've got many, many notes written down. I've already had to read a few papers to prep, and it's like every time you think you know something, you just realize how much you don't know. And this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. So enjoy, everyone, and until the next episode, we're going to be 1042.